Okay, welcome to neoan3 Deep Dive. Today we're going to look at a frame, which is a concept that if you're coming from a different background, meaning that you're used to particular frameworks like either on the PHP end like Laravel or Symfony or whatever else is out there, or if you explored capabilities of different backend technologies like Node.js or whatever, you might not be familiar with the concept of frames, but you might be familiar with the concept of middleware. So let us try to define, what is the difference, and what is a frame in neoan3, and how can it be used, how can it be utilized, what are basically what kind of understanding is required to grasp what is happening here. So the way to use neoan3 basically has a couple of capabilities, and people that have used the CLI will probably notice that depending on whether or not you create a new route component or a new API component, there are differences in how your page is constructed. So that is a default behavior. You can of course change that and with the template function, but in the default model, you will basically see that what we now look at is what a route component basically does. So you have a particular route. So let's just say you create a particular endpoint, and that endpoint will basically initiate the controller and execute the init function. In the init function, you normally then find the the Unicore singleton, and that will then load a particular frame, and that frame will then basically extend to the controller and generate what we call the stream of consciousness. How does this look like? It's pretty simple. So that's basically a what's called demo. So it's the demo controller in your component folder, and what you will basically find there is normally like you can see that it extends the Unicore, and the Unicore is nothing but a facilitator to basically wrap and unify the serve of the core and initiate it with a particular frame. So what do we see here is, so first there is a high-level interceptor. That's more or less like a demo. Normally you will have your session initiated in the frame. So this example would, for example, not work with the demo that you download out of the box. So if you install a clean neoan3 installation, it will basically you won't even have a session app installed. But the idea, of course, why I'm showing it anyway is pretty simple. So you might have particular considerations of multiple kinds, right? So you might, for example, say, well, before I initiate the core, before I'm running any kind of logic that computes things and is potentially draining on my performance, I might already want to decide that I preload particular things, or I don't want to allow access to a particular page, and so on. So that is why it's shown here as a possibility to say, like, well, before you load anything, make particular decisions, set particular variables, like whatever needs to be done before the frame is initiated. And then you can basically see I'm using this uni, so that's basically the Unicore constructor, and I load my frame. So we now assume that there's a frame called my frame, and that is what I'm now initiating. So that also means that if you have a particular component that is potentially used by multiple frames, so you have different forms of executing this, then this might as well be a variable right now. So you could, for example, go by a particular route and then say, well, depending on whether or not I visit demo or I visit demo slash app2, then different frames are loaded and execute maybe different functionality. And we'll later get to the point of why that might be interesting. But for now, let's just assume that's static. And so you just write my frame and then it loads the frame. And basically from there on, you use the singleton and keep in the stream of consciousness. And just because there's probably no explanation of what I mean by stream of consciousness. So one of the concepts of neoan3 is that you can read everything that's happening in the init function of a route, keeping it very, very clean when it comes to topics like, the cognitive load. We say, like, I can read exactly what happens when, without getting confused on, what happens before and where to find, particular functionality. I mean, basically, you can read from top to bottom what happens when. So in this case, frame is loaded. I fill the main hook with a demo, the demo view, and then I output or effectively echo what I see here. So that's option one. And as I already told you before, that is not necessarily how we need to work. So in this example, what we do is we come in with a particular endpoint, generating a particular route. So we're also going to generate, let's just assume demo for now. And we do want to extend a particular frame now with the controller, and then basically start the stream of consciousness, or just use a classical OOP loading in order to generate our functionality or business logic. So how would that look like? And this is maybe something that you've not seen with an init function. In any kind of demos I provide, this would classically be how an API endpoint would work. So I'm extending docs. Docs is in that case my frame. Should have probably called it, as you can see here, it's a frame. Should have probably called it my frame as well, just to be more relatable to the other example. And then I execute the init. So in this scenario, we have already basically run the construct of the frame. That's important for later, and basically have everything available. And as you can see, I also write this now not in the stream of consciousness, but just as a regular functionality. So I have basically now available this of the class itself, or the parent, so docs, or as you can see from the serve, so from the core, and can execute everything like that, which also means that as long as I return the context, so as long as I return this, I can still write this in the stream of consciousness. So as for example, this is a hook function, which basically means instead of getting a new line, this output, I could simply have my little arrow here and say output. So that would still work. Also, if I create functions here, so as long as I return this, I can basically stay in the singleton pattern and stay in the stream of consciousness. I just wanted to show you something else now. So this is basically what I explain here. Demo extends docs, docs extends serve, and that's basically how availability and inheritance works. So the next question that I get a lot is what kind of functionality do I place in the frame, right? Because we have multiple ways of basically hooking in functionality. Why don't I do everything on the controller level? And they're basically, that depends a lot on what you do and where you want to place logic. And we get into that maybe later. But on a very high level, so it's logic that you want to execute on every controller. So maybe, like providing, for example, variables for your database connectivity, where you say, like, this just needs to be done. I don't want to write this in every controller. And other very global configurations. So let's just say that I have a standard header that I don't want to place that hook. So as long as I don't override it in the route component, I just always want to load this particular header, and then only you basically use main in my controllers themselves. And then maybe you want to intercept a couple of things, and the last thing is of course to overwrite or extend the methods of the core. Now this is something that's pretty powerful in neoan3. Is the way the core works is it doesn't protect anything. They're very little private properties. I mean, most things that come out of the box you can overwrite and are intended to be overwritten if that is required for your frame. What that means is probably easily seen in code, so let's just keep that in mind for now. And look at some common frame functions that you will basically find in a lot of demo code I provide, or also in a lot of projects. And one of the most obvious things is a construct function. So this serves the core basically constructs the general ability to have everything available to you and inherit everything that you need. Now there might be a logical necessity to say, like, I simply, without calling anything, want to extend what serve does, and basically will overwrite the construct function, will call the parent's construct, and place additional functionality in there that I simply want to ensure that it's loaded. For example, initiating a particular checks. Let's say it's a completely restricted system. Or maybe I just want to initiate a session at this point, or load particular apps, stuff like that. Then the constants function. The constants function is by default, I mean, you also override it, but by default it's empty. So this is basically a shortcut, and it's a little bit of a legacy system. You have a couple of includes and parameters, meta information that you want to set globally. You can do that using the constants function in an array rather than adding it with single calls to add head and meta and all that kind of stuff. So you basically give it your environment variables when you say, like, yes, I want to use, I don't know, Vue.js on the front end. Please ensure that it's included in the header, and so on. And the possibility to basically have additional functionality available. And so when you say, like, well, my controllers need something that goes beyond what neoan3 ships out of the box with, so I have particular functions that do things that I need on a lot of different controllers, and I don't want to repeat myself. So I place those functions in the frame, and then they're available to every controller using that frame. The overriding, I mean, we already talked about this. So the best method of basically getting a feeling of that is basically looking into it, right? So let's actually do that for now, and stop this slideshow here, and basically look at a frame. So what would such a frame do? Such a frame would automatically or out of the box would basically have nothing, right? So what we see here is we have constants. That's what we talked about. So I give it a couple of general things that I want to have loaded. So like style sheets, JS, and my favicon, my manifest in this case. I just did a video on PWA, and probably some other things that I simply want to have ensured that they're loaded on each occasion. And then here we see the construct. So I basically have, well, say like, well, whenever this frame is used, like call the parent's construct. In this case, I want to do this before. So in common scenarios, this is what you want to do. Sometimes you want to place something before the construct is executed. You should think about that. And in most cases, you want to place it after the parent is constructed, so after the serve initiated itself. But maybe you need particular information available to, for example, override particular functionality or variables from the serve. So here I do my stuff. In that case, like I get my credentials for the database and my stateless JWT secret, load that in just to make that available and initiate that whenever I load a frame. So what else could we do? So now we could basically say, okay, function add or something global. Say that's a function, and that basically, well, let's just construct something here that's probably a little bit weird, but no, not even that. Let's just do it like this, and then basically say this here is Sam, and then say return this. Okay, so what I have right now is this is unused, but if I am on any kind of component using it, so let's just say this very, very straightforward component. So what I all of a sudden have is I have this available now as a function. Again, I return this so I can keep in the singleton context here. So basically, if I call this, then Sam is set, right? So let's basically try this out by simply do a callback this and oops and test and create a function test and say this is available here. And so what I'm going to do is actually just test it right now. Let's actually output it very ugly and say uni Sam. No, sorry, what did we call it? Here. Okay, sure. Here. So if I hold on, I'm just trying to find my this. Okay. That's now running as a PWA that I haven't updated. Hold on a second. Yeah, that's from cache now. That is something I should have prepared better. Let's actually quickly simply kill that. Let's simply kill that now with a very basic. Oh, whoops. Nope. I want to get rid of this and this. That's still registered. Sorry, give me a second. I am going to force this to happen. Okay. Sorry about that. So this is now null, right? Because we have not executed the something global yet. So what if I said, okay, so before I'm doing this, I'm going to say and I forgot again, did I call it something global? Yeah, something global. Okay, something global. Okay, so, and if I call it now, we can see I get Sam. So now basically I have this something global available in all of the components that actually use this frame. So that's something that, I mean, probably it's not that primitive, but let's say you have particular functionality that you say like you want to have available. So a more common thing, or the last one on the list of what we talked about, is to overwrite functionality of the serve, right? So if I say like, let's get rid of all of this and say, well, my output works a little bit different. I don't really want to output anything based on the regular behavior. I, for example, want to write to a cache, or I want to execute pug before doing so, and so on. So I have the function possibility to basically say, I'm going to overwrite output. And it's going to probably scream at me because it expects me to do the parent, and actually I will do this. So let's just say I could do stuff like add something to output, and then execute output, right? I could do that. Or I completely, oh yeah, that's actually something that we need to do. Or I do completely something else and basically say, well, instead of doing the output from the serve, we are going to have a completely different thing, and basically say, no, the only thing I'm doing here is I'm going to output this HTML, right? Which I think is private. Yep, that is private. That doesn't work. Probably the wrong example, but just as a very primitive example. So again, you would probably do something here like running particular compilers or whatever, writing and reading from cache, stuff, whatever needs to happen. I mean, the important thing here is, can I do this? No. That you understand that all of the availability here is what's actually happening. All of those functions are public and can be overwritten or added to. And that's a little bit the power of the frame, and there are very good use cases for it. And that's basically how you want to work with that. So if I now would execute that, then of course, that would be rather boring because the only thing I see is overwrite all. But I naturally can catch whatever I really want to do here, and for example, execute pug or do all kinds of things that I don't have time to get into. But when you look at this, then basically you have a couple of questions. For example, like, okay, but what do I need this all of the time? Right? It's because now I have potentially a lot of global functionality that I don't really require in all of my endpoints. So for example, if I make an API call, should I really bother loading particular assets and so on? And that's a very good question. And so what you will find is that at a particular point, when you talk about like really big applications and you want to be scalable, then what you do is let's go to the next one. You're going to ask yourself, should I use multiple frames in the project? And that is something that you should consider. So there are particular reasons to do so, especially when you say, well, I have a frame for my mailing functionality. I just generate email templates out of it, and there's a particular system I use, or I have, for example, an API frame that I want to use that only targets particular things. It doesn't look for sessions. It doesn't initiate, particular things, and so on. So basically, yes, it does make sense to create multiple frames for a project if that project justifies it. and if you want to well, basically get a better performance. And so those are the things you should probably consider here. On the left is don't repeat yourself. So does it make sense to have like a couple of frames and you're going to write the database information in there every time to the same database and so on? Probably not something you want to do. You should consider performance. So yes, in theory, it is more performant to have frames that are more targeted. But then, eventually you should consider the abstraction layer. So if you only need this for one or two particular routes or API endpoints or custom elements or whatever, maybe it doesn't really make sense to create a frame, and you can either not use a frame or overwrite functionality from your frame instead on the controller itself, because of course I can still do that. I don't need the frame is just something that facilitates exactly that, right? To use functionality that is global to that frame. So other things are multiple front ends. That's a possibility. I'm currently building a headless CMS, and basically it hosts its own demo. So the whole backend would use something that doesn't require a lot of loaded components, a lot of JS files and so on that I globally load would not be required for the backend, but for the front end. Do I have multiple use cases for routes? So that's also something I might consider. We already talked about this. There's the possibility to basically say, well, my route is dependent on the frame, so I made it clear that it can be used by multiple frames, and it's cleanly intended to do that. And then basically I use depending on the endpoint I'm using or on the route I'm using, I am loading a different frame for a particular controller. And the targeted subproject, we already talked about this, is basically I have particular functionality that, has a different kind of requirement. I have, maybe a completely different way of constructing my HTML, because it's not with CSS, but inline styles and so on. So I want to have basically something particularly targeted for a use case that I use within the project, but has its own particular sets and variables and setup that I require. That's about it. This is a little bit of more of a format that I'm trying out right now, so it's more of a conceptual way of looking at things and explaining also why certain concepts are built the way they're built. So, less coding, more philosophy, if you want so. And I hope it helps you to understand what a frame is, and then basically come up with your solutions depending on what you want to do in order to facilitate that power in the way that is most suitable to you and your team. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again. And we're going to talk about the next deep dive topic soon.